Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'm pleased to welcome you to another lecture in the North and the Civil War New England Symposium held at the Massachusetts School of Law in October of 2003. Our next speaker, Professor Jackie Campbell, is an old friend of ours. Haven't seen her in a long time. I think she's still at the University of Connecticut now. When we first met her, her name was Jackie Bindman, Bindman, and she was a doctoral student at Duke University. We had been asked to provide some support to help her in her doctoral dissertation and so forth. And she had zeroed in on a program we were going to do on Sherman's March to the Sea. It was going to be at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah, Georgia, I think back in early 2000 or 1998, and this now being October 2003. We, of course, were happy to do that. I met with Alex Rowland, her major professor at Duke, turned down his offer. He asked me if I would like to enter the doctoral program, and my wife, who has a doctorate, was teaching at the time, and I said, no, one doctor in the family is plenty enough. And so I continued on with Blue and Gray, but vowed that I would help any way I could. And of course, part of the payback for that was, as you're aware, we had a symposium that the Duke History Department co-sponsored at Duke University a few years later, in which we had great participation there. In exchange for that, what we had done is we provided a little bit of financial support to Jackie, but what we mostly did is we networked her. We hooked her up with Mark Grimsley and others who were integrally aware of the ramifications of the March to the Sea. And Jackie's interest was in the interrelationship of the civilians who ran and got in the way of Sherman's men, as well as the Southern irregulars who harassed Sherman's bummers and so forth as they moved north. And so the things that happened to women were of significance to Jackie, and that's what she wished to study and to write about. And of course, you'll also notice Jackie has a bit of a Scottish brogue. I don't, but she does. And she's from Scotland, or Scotland, as they say. And she's just a delightful lady. We enjoyed working with her. She did write a book, When Sherman Marched North from the Sea, which deals with the relationship between civilians in South Carolina and North Carolina in the wake of Sherman's march north to join up with Grant's army and help end the war in February and March of 1865. So when I asked Jackie to come over, she was close by because she was at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. She was more than happy to come over and make a presentation. And so I asked her to focus on where she had gone with her research since she had written the book. And so her topic today is the Civil War and women's issues. Sit back, relax, enjoy Jackie Campbell. Good friend Jackie Campbell, who teaches at the University of Connecticut, had just come back from England, was vulnerable, didn't realize what I was calling for, was actually foolish enough to return the phone call, in which she did. I said, Jackie, I need a big favor, and she agreed graciously to come on in here with short notice and deliver a talk in Harold's absence. And what a treat it will be for you as well, because Jackie has just within the last couple of days has had her book released by the University of North Carolina Press on Sherman's March to the Carolinas' impact on the civilians in the Carolinas, and that's what she's going to talk to you about today. So please join me in welcoming Jackie Campbell.
I wish you hadn't given me that big build-up, because not as prepared as I would have liked to have been, but I'll do my best. And is that better? Okay, all right. I was looking at the kind of the preview for the program, and I see we're talking about how lost cause and other issues are usually seen through the eyes of the South. And I'm actually going to talk about the lost cause, but I'm going to try and explain how I see the lost cause, and particularly Sherman and Southern women, as being inextricably linked. I have a great debt to the Blue and the Grey Society. They were nice enough to sponsor me when I was a graduate student, which was not all that terribly long ago as a non-traditional age graduate student. I actually met Professor Hathaway at Savannah. I don't know if he remembers. It's about 7 years ago. And I remember telling him I was interested in gender in the Civil War, and his eyes glazed over. So hopefully, I'm hoping to persuade Professor Hathaway that maybe I have a point. And also, I just want to say I hope I'm not stepping on Professor Simpson's toes, because I see he's going to talk about the home front too, but I came in very unprepared. Okay, so in February 1865, a Confederate officer learned that Sherman's soldiers were an imminent threat to his South Carolina family. He wrote to his mother and sisters from the Virginia trenches and warned them that they were likely to lose all their material possessions. But his words expressed no concern over their physical safety. In fact, he advised his female kin that should any scoundrel intrude or go rummaging around the place, don't hesitate to shoot. That same month, an ex-slave who decided to remain on her South Carolina plantation home rather than flee with the Union troops bitterly complained that the war had been more about stealing than, quote, a holy war for the liberation of the poor African slave people. All she had to thank the Yankees for, she said, was a hungry belly and freedom. At the same time, a Union officer surveyed the charred remains of Columbia, the South Carolina capital, and openly wept at the distress of homeless women and children. Now, these three commentaries on the nature of Sherman's campaign through the Confederate heartland convey a very different picture from traditional accounts of military strategy that destroyed both the war resources and the morale of the Southern people. And they also convey a very different picture than that of the popular memory of the Civil War. Lost cause ideology changed the roles of all these players. It obscured the role of blacks in the Civil War. It suggested that Confederate women were both loyal, but essentially passive, appendages of Confederate heroes and victims of Yankee soldiers, who were themselves universal brutes, none more so than the man who personified Yankee atrocities, William Sherman. What I'd like to do is take you back to the heart of Sherman's campaign, behind the crust of mythology that surrounds it, and examine the confrontations between Union soldiers and Southern civilians, black and white. And by doing so, I think we gain a better understanding of the development of the lost cause, which is a phenomenon that continues to influence American perceptions of the war, and still affects intersectional relationships, I would say. As an example, let me just repeat an anecdote that a colleague of mine reported. He had just come back from a South Carolina archive where he was doing some research, and he heard the librarian apologizing that some of the 1890s census materials seemed to be missing, and her explanation was that General Sherman probably destroyed it. Okay, so what I want to suggest here is three things. First, that Confederate women were far from the helpless Southern belles of popular culture, that African Americans' decisions of whether to stay on the plantation or flee with Union troops was a complex one, and that Union soldiers who took part in Sherman's campaign were not universal brutes, but had their own sense of honor. That's the one I find hardest in the South to kind of convince people of, but I'm sure you'll be sympathetic to that. With 3 out of 4 eligible Southern men in the service, the most typical characteristic of the confrontation was that Southern women faced the enemy alone. Even those men who remained at home often hid, leaving families without a male protector. A Union colonel detailed one of the few occasions on which his regiment came across Confederate soldiers hiding behind a house. After driving the enemy away, Union Colonel Jackson found the house was filled with women and children. This was chivalry indeed, to hide behind women and children, was his sarcastic comment. So why would Southern men hide from the approaching enemy, leaving their female kin to face the onslaught alone? The explanation, I would suggest, lies in conflicts and connections in ideas about gender roles in the antebellum North and South. One could well make the argument that both Yankees and Confederates shared a belief that privileges of race and class offered certain white elite women a guarantee of protection. But I'd also suggest that one of the keys to understanding why Southern men felt that Confederate women were well prepared and equipped to serve as defenders of the home is that they understood female strength in a different way than their Northern counterparts. As industrialization and urbanization took place in the North, the home and the workplace became increasingly separate spaces. This change was the genesis of changing ideas about male and female roles. Women were assigned the roles of moral guardians who were to provide stability and shelter for men who were increasingly involved in a hostile world of business and politics. And the idea that women had a superior moral strength was based on a belief that they were inherently less passionate than their men. In the South, however, there was a slightly different trajectory. The household endured in the agricultural South as a center of production, and this idea of separate spheres for men and women did not flower in the same way. And especially in the North, gender was becoming an especially salient political division, while in the South, race remained the primary determinant of social and political power. Now, both North and South placed a great deal of importance on a woman's outward display of submission to male authority. In the South, however, this was not based on a belief that women were inherently delicate creatures, but rather that they chose to restrain an inner strength for the benefit of social harmony and family honor. It was thus permissible for Southern women to display passion and proficiency, provided it was in support of the family. And on the basis of this understanding, Southern women frequently managed farms and plantations alone and saw themselves responsible for both the material and the cultural survival of their families. So when threatened by an invading army, they frequently responded with a passion worthy of both mothers and warriors. In fact, during an invasion, women often recognized the advantage of having no men present. A Georgia woman expressed her relief that there was no gentleman in her house when Sherman passed. He would have been no protection, she continued, adding that he may also have been badly treated. Another woman confirmed this opinion, writing to her father that women are the best defenders of themselves and their property. Some men actually feared the passions that might be revealed by their female kin's overzealous defense of the hearth. One man begged his wife to stay in her room, lest, and I'm quoting, she should betray her indignation and give vent to her feelings in words which might cause the hyenas to insult her. While both North and South embraced gender distinctions, they understood and interpreted them in different ways. When Northern soldiers encountered defiant and vituperative Southern women, they frequently concluded that such inappropriate displays crossed the boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. Branding them she-devils, some Union men even blamed Southern women for keeping up the war, displaying a vindictiveness and a zeal for blood that seemed unprecedented. By the time Sherman's men had reached Savannah, Georgia, the culmination of their march to the sea, many had determined that Southern women were the staunchest supporters of the war. In academic circles and in popular culture, Sherman's entire offensive is frequently referred to as the March to the Sea, which obscures the importance of his continuing advance to the Carolinas. Sherman saw the Carolinas campaign as crucial and a great deal more difficult than his all but unobstructed march through Georgia. And soldiers frequently referred to the Georgia stage of their campaign in festive terms. They talked about it as picnicking and the poetry of campaigning. But once they went into South Carolina, their mood changed drastically, because this was the state that they called the cradle of secession, the state that had instigated 4 years of bloody war, and now South Carolina was to pay the price of keeping them away from home for so long. Sherman wrote of the insatiable desire of his army to wreak vengeance on the Palmetto State and was sure his men would show less restraint. When Sherman's men set foot on South Carolina soil, they crossed both a geographical and a cultural fault line. Sherman reported villainous weather conditions that delayed the main thrust of his army for over a month. This hostile environment fueled Northern soldiers' fury, and a desire for revenge and disparaging remarks about the countryside were soon extended to embrace Southern culture as a whole. The confrontation between Sherman's men and Southern civilians involved a clash of both physical space and ideological space. When the invasion and punishment of South Carolina became an invasion of Southern homes, many soldiers struggled with a series of conflicting emotions. When white civilians faced the demons of their worst nightmares, fear frequently turned to anger. African Americans' reactions were even more complex. Their initial delight at what they believed was the army of emancipation often turned to terror as Yankees plundered slave homes and assaulted black women. From the outset, the physical and psychological obstacles of the new campaign challenged soldiers in ways that far exceeded their previous experience. General Alpheus Williams wrote that the campaign of the Carolinas was a decided contrast to the Georgia March. In South Carolina, it was all muds, swamps, treacherous quicksands, and quagmires. Soldiers wrote that these new demands made the Georgia campaign seem like a joke in comparison. The sodden ground created obstacles in the countryside that would have stopped a less determined group in their tracks. Soldiers had to cross rivers whose sedgy, oozy banks were covered with dismal swamps, and temperatures plummeted. Soldiers reported that ice froze on hats and trees, and they had to wade through water so bitterly cold that many became almost paralyzed. In fact, so frequent are soldiers' complaints about the hostile environments that their feelings towards South Carolina could only have been inflamed. But their buoyant confidence in both themselves and their leaders allowed them to accomplish the unthinkable. Confederate generals later confessed that they believed it was absolutely impossible for any army to march across South Carolina in such conditions. As Union troops struggled through swamps and mud, they extended their contempt to embrace the entire state. A Connecticut soldier wrote that he wouldn't take all he'd seen of South Carolina as a present, and others commented on poverty and what they judged to be sloth. In fact, Union soldiers were inclined to interpret the landscape in reference to their own homes. Many of Sherman's men came from the western states, which were full of new towns. There, professional surveyors had laid out straight roads and neat towns in which squares and courthouses imposed a sense of order over the countryside. Now, in the rural South, northern soldiers found small towns, poor roads, and inferior housing, all indications that their preconceptions of Southern inferiority had been correct. The contempt these soldiers felt for South Carolina was soon to become evident in both words and deeds. Major Osborne believed South Carolina to be a contemptible country. He extended the sentiment to the inhabitants, who he found impudent and disgusting. Captain George Pepper concluded that the soil is treacherous like the people who own it. By early 1865, a Union officer described the South Carolina countryside as alive with men who made foraging their sole business. Squads of soldiers were sent in advance of Sherman's army, purportedly in organized units under the supervision of officers. But in fact, bands of foragers, whom one Union soldier described as unequaled in scientific and authorized stealing, ransacked homes and ravaged the landscape. Black families who had longed for freedom soon realized that few Union soldiers harbored true abolitionist sympathies. The majority of Sherman's men regarded the slave population as a tool with which to strike at the economic foundation of Southern society. An officer reported that Sherman's Rough Riders would go through a Negro cabin with just as much freedom and vivacity as they loot the dwelling of a wealthy planter. Union officers were aware of the mistreatment of blacks, and especially of assaults on black women. At the start of the Carolina campaign, Major General O. Howard expressed concern over the many depredations that would disgrace us even in the enemy's country, namely the robbing of some Negro cabins and abusing their women. Many white soldiers viewed black women as what they called, quote, the legitimate praise of lust, and some even believed that colored women are proud to have intercourse with white men. Northern attitudes towards race varied, of course. One soldier wrote to his wife that his earlier abolitionist sympathies were in fact weakening, for, as he wrote, it is first a nigger, then a mule, then a soldier. Others were impressed by blacks' determination and bravery. But despite the fact that the soldiers frequently mistreated them, still many African Americans felt behind Sherman's lines, inspired with the possibility of freedom. Enslaved blacks frequently found Union soldiers as capricious as white Southerners, complicating their decision of whether or not to flee. Many became angry when Northern troops destroyed their property, stole their goods, and assaulted black women. Despite repeated attempts to curb the indiscriminate pillaging of black homes, these infamous practices continued. Thus, Southern blacks in the path of Sherman's army found themselves in a liminal space between two racist forces, and for many of them, a sensible decision may have been to remain with the devil they knew. On the other hand, the white women who experienced an army of invasion tearing up their homeland and destroying their possessions suffered no such dilemma. Sherman's men frequently complained that Southern whites refused to recognize either the cultural or military superiority of the North, and expressed astonishment at the intensity with which Confederate women fought to maintain both their dignity and their property. One such woman who came face to face with General Sherman himself did not hesitate to identify herself as the wife of a rebel soldier. When Union cavalry invaded her home, Jane Sams told them in no uncertain terms that she expected civil and polite treatment. Although the soldiers in question tried to intimidate her, she refused to back down. "My strength had been given to me by an almighty power," she wrote, "and could not be taken from me by a Yankee's venomous tongue." It was their own venomous tongues that many white women used as their primary weapon against the Yankee invaders, eliciting responses of both reluctant admiration and moral castigation. A New Jersey lieutenant remarked on how determined and resolute he found the white women of the Palmetto State. One of his comrades commented that the so-called tender sex was the match of the roughest and most brutal soldier when it came to the use of obscene words. One Confederate woman boasted that many of her female friends vented their wrath against the Union troops to such an extent that soldiers claimed the women talked too damn strong and were not worthy of protection. Such overt manifestations of female power disconcerted Union soldiers who carried their own set of domestic values into the war. Values that were based upon the image of home as a haven, and an image of women based on their roles as mothers and wives. And this conflated the moral superiority that was assigned to women with an innate pacifism. Now, historians have generally viewed Northern women as much more progressive than their Southern counterparts, but in the North, female respectability was often based on a perceived female helplessness rather than a sense of respect for womanhood. So Union soldiers' motivation to protect white women was frequently born of a belief that it validated their own manhood. It was therefore relatively easy for Northern soldiers to define Southern women who refused to play the role of passive victim as aberrant. One Union soldier expressed sympathy for those women who sat with grief on their countenances or tears rolling down their cheeks. But those Southern women who vented their feelings in curses and rude epithets made it difficult for him to overlook what the women of the South have done to keep up this war. Not only had Southern women stepped beyond the pale of appropriate female behavior, but they had apparently also failed in their duties as Republican mothers. That role that channeled women's moral superiority into the production of patriotic citizens had clearly gone awry in the South. As there was no sustained attack in the North, it's difficult to tell whether representations and realities would have been equally contradictory had Yankee women been called upon to confront an invading army. Nevertheless, while Union soldiers blamed Southern women for their part in supporting the Confederate effort, they continued to seek support and validation from their own families. Although they believed South Carolina deserved punishment for instigating a war that had kept them away for so long, contact with Southern civilians raised a certain amount of ambivalence regarding the suffering of women and children. Junior Major General Appius Williams reported that the Army spared nothing and that he found the sights, quote, often terribly sublime and grand, but also often intensely painful. "How would you like to have troops passing your house constantly for 2 days, dozens within it all the time, ransacking and plundering?" a Union corporal asked his sister. Union soldiers' desire to punish South Carolina encouraged them to cross the boundaries of legitimate foraging practices. Captain Pepper chronicled yet another form of what he called devastation practiced by the troops, which was the deliberate and systematic robbery for the sake of gain. Pepper reported that soldiers stole not only money, but also plate and silver spoons, silk dresses, elegant articles of the toilet, pistols, and indeed whatever the soldier can take away in hopes to sell. Men who cherished their own set of domestic values now found themselves in a situation where the virtues of manhood were being redefined and their sense of morality stretched. They understood that the success of their campaign necessitated behavior that would not have been acceptable at home, and many shared Southerners' concerns over military depredations. A Michigan soldier wrote to his family that the extent of the destruction sickened him, and that for me in South Carolina to say is considerable. He added, an Army chaplain commented that such outrages were enough to make a soldier blush. But his concern was not so much over the suffering of Southern civilians as his tendency towards demoralization amongst Union troops. In a study of Union policy towards civilians, military historian Mark Grimsley, who I know some of you have heard speak at these occasions, Grimsley argues that Sherman did not conduct a policy of total war, but rather one that was limited by the soldiers' underlying sense of morality, and it was this combination of severity and restraint that was the innovative aspect of Sherman's campaign. His military strategy, however, was a rediscovery of an older form of European warfare, where massive raiding expeditions known as chevauchés, designed to demoralize and subjugate inhabitants of enemy territory, pillaged or destroyed everything in their path. Grimsley finds Sherman's strategy similar to this earlier form of warfare, and yet also more enlightened because it was conducted, as he argues, not by brutes, but by men from good families with strong moral values that stayed their hand. If Grimsley is correct, then this moral calculus might have been a double-edged sword, for an attack on women would surely not be considered the most heroic part of warfare. Soldiers needed to rationalize their discomfort in violating, even if only symbolically, Southern white womanhood. The limits of behavior might be stretched in wartime. Still, Sherman's campaign was shaped to prevailing ideas that illuminated 19th century social values. In the face of these increased levels of destruction in South Carolina, moral castigations of Southern womanhood proved insufficient rationalization. In these circumstances, many soldiers eased their consciences by differentiating their own roles as legitimate foragers from those who indulged in immoral pillaging. A Union lieutenant wrote in his journal that although he felt there was retributive justice in the destruction he saw around him, still he did not wish, quote, to be the agent. A Connecticut soldier wrote he could not countenance the action of some of his comrades who seemed to have no regard for anything that is gentlemanly. Still, he personally did not intend to indulge in such behavior. I have my certain duty to do, he wrote, and that I intend to perform as faithfully as I know how and let plundering alone. The struggle of essentially moral men to come to terms with the violence and terror they were bringing to Southern homes suggests that while Sherman's strategy may have had historical precedent in military terms, in ideological terms it was understood differently. If we examine Sherman's campaign through the lens of gender, other factors come to light that clarify soldiers' restraint and ambivalence. During the period of the chevauchée, no ideas about separate spheres for men and women existed. Furthermore, during this period, women had been a normal part of the early armies, performing essential support roles. So earlier warfare on a civilian population was less stratified by gender. During the 18th century, the military increasingly took control of the army, and within 100 years, women's vital roles had become obscured. At the same time as armies were becoming exclusively military and exclusively masculine, military history was emerging as a field designed to train young men in the art of warfare. The focus on battlefield tactics and strategy contributed to the invisibility of women as an essential part of these earlier military efforts. These changes occurred at the same time as the development of separate sphere ideology. And so models that masculinize both politics and the military reinforced the exclusion of women from both. The enforcement of these boundaries in both social and military practices altered the culturally sanctioned limits of war. It was easy for armed men to cross the physical boundaries, but crossing the conceptual boundaries that were constructed to fix home front and battlefront and gender demarcations was more problematic. In Columbia, the South Carolina capital, the wrath of the Union Army reached its zenith as fire consumed the capital city. But even here, individual encounters between civilians and soldiers often played out in very different ways from the grand narrative of pillage and destruction. Not to deny terror, suffering, and very real loss, but a gamut of emotions engulfed the cities that ranged from terror to respect and from sympathy to disdain. Those who experienced terror most often expressed it through hellish images of devils against a backdrop of flame. A crowd of soldiers in one woman's yard filled the night air with, quote, fierce yells of demoniac delight while their forms shone out hideously in numbers on all sides in the light of her flaming home. Throughout the Saturnalia, soldiers broke into houses, threatened the residents, destroyed their possessions, and made off with valuables while laughing and saying coarse things or talking in loud rough tones. A roaring stream of drunkards poured into Mrs. Ravenel's home, tearing up her carpets, bursting open her trunks, and taking her goods. But although she described them as plundering and raging, still to her they seemed curiously civil and abstaining from personal insult. Although white women in Columbia described the Yankees as a group in the most vituperative terms, many soldiers and civilians touched each other on a very human level. In the accounts of the destruction of Columbia written by civilians during or immediately after the event, one of the most notable features is the sympathy and kindness of individual guards. A woman who had described Sherman's men as tigers was protected by a Yankee captain from Iowa. Lily Logan wrote to her brother that she owed a great deal to the protection and kindness of a Yankee officer. Another guard openly wept at the state of the city. The kind-hearted man was appalled, wrote his Southern charge. The next morning, with tears in his eyes, he confessed that if he were witness to rebels burning down his home, he would hate them all his lifetime. Many Union soldiers had misgivings about attacking Southern homes and terrorizing civilians. Some took the time to rationalize feelings of both guilt and pride over the destruction they saw around them. One officer wrote that he had never envisioned how frightful the reality would be. Similarly, a Union chaplain found the sight of crying and despondent women and children too bad to be endured. Major Osborne, on the other hand, purposely exercised selective memory. I have, he noted, seen too much suffering by far, and choose rather to remember the magnificent splendor of this burning city. In similar vein, despite expressions of compassion made earlier, Major Connolly decided he wouldn't have missed it for anything. Chief Commissary Officer George Ballack also struggled to come to terms with his emotions. By the time he reached North Carolina, however, he focused on feelings of pride in General Sherman. "My heart fairly swells with honest pride within me when I think of the results of his operation," he wrote. "All other movements of the war sink into insignificance when viewed beside his." Citizens of Columbia also shifted their attention to the leadership of Sherman, holding him directly responsible for their plight. "After all," remarked one, "Sherman's troops were renowned for their discipline. They were as an army completely in the hands of the officer," he wrote. "Never was discipline more complete." And Mrs. Ravenel felt that the admirable discipline of General Sherman's army cannot be too highly estimated. "They greatly mistake who attribute the horrors of that night to accident," she continued. "The skillful commander held his men in the hollow of his hand and said to them, 'So far shall thou go and no further.'" In the wake of Sherman's army, the citizens of Columbia found the sadness and stillness almost palpable. A devastated home front was Sherman's most immediate goal. He trusted that an invasion of both geographical and psychological space would leave in its wake a population focused on the need for food and shelter rather than on supporting further political and military conflict. South Carolinians were both materially and spiritually exhausted and concerned over shortages of food. However, initial feelings of disillusionment and war weariness were not enduring emotions for all citizens, but frequently an initial step in a path towards a rededication to Southern independence. In the South Carolina capital, initial feelings of despondency, particularly among privileged whites, were subsequently channeled into a rededication to the Confederate cause, a deification of General Robert E. Lee, and a demonization of William T. Sherman. Confederate women filled their correspondence with vows that they would continue the struggle, disabusing Yankees of the notion that they were subdued. Drawing upon that same sense of honor that was so vital a component in keeping Southern soldiers in the field, many white women took pride in the fact that they had faced Sherman's army of demons unflinchingly, declared their enduring support for cause and country, and earned a reputation as virulent rebels. It has been argued elsewhere that Confederate women's commitment to the cause waned in the final months of the war, as their many sacrifices seemed increasingly useless. But those who had survived an army of invasion without the protection of their men, many of these now called upon Southern soldiers to remain at their post and exert vengeance on the enemy. Confronting the enemy allowed these women to share in a sense of responsibility for actively defending the Confederacy, with a consequent upsurge in patriotism. And having met Sherman soldiers face to face, they now had an enemy on whom to vent their wrath. One young woman heard that the spirit of the people was even better after the Union attack. Now that they have experienced the Yankees' tender mercies, they are resolved to persevere unto the bitter end, she wrote. Even the news of Lee's defeat did not quash their hopes, and many remained convinced that while the South might be overpowered, it would never be conquered, and that the next generation would see the South free and independent. "Our Southern blood rose in stronger rebellion than ever," wrote one young woman, "and we all determined that, if obliged to submit, never could they subdue us." The only question now, it seemed to young Emma LeConte of Columbia, was not what hope, but what new bitterness. For 2 weeks following this diary entry, she felt such rage that she feared to express her sentiments in words. Finally, she steeled herself to take a walk among the ruins of her once grand city. It was a moonlit night, and her mind waxed poetic. This is what she wrote in her diary. "As far as the eye could see, only spectre-like chimneys and the shutter walls, all flooded over by the rich moonlight, which gave them a mysterious but mellow softness, and quite took from them the ghastly air which they wear in the sunlight. They only lacked moss and lichens and tangled vines to make us believe that we stood in some ruined city of antiquity." In these romantic images lay the seeds of the lost cause ideology that was to flourish in the ensuing years. Now, it is true that in the immediate post-war period, a disparity of reactions between men and women became increasingly apparent. But this was in sharp contrast to wartime experiences when many women had become central players. In the aftermath, soldiers could identify with comrades, even across enemy lines, by mutual recognition of duty fulfilled. Women were denied a similar sense of closure. But they would not go gently into their more passive roles as rehabilitators of Southern men and guardians of Southern memory. Mary Chestnut, a famous Southern diarist, believed that women were forced to be realistic when it came to material losses, for the men have the option to, quote, die like patriots. Why does the president not call out the women, asked Emma LeConte. We would go and fight. We would all better die together. One young North Carolinian woman committed to her journal such sentiments that she dared not speak aloud. Men of the South, are you dead to all shame, she asked. How could they accept their present subjugated state? 1,000 times it were better that you had all fallen on your swords, she continued. Sometime later, a South Carolina woman tried to explain this gendered nature of healing. All women, in her opinion, preferred death or annihilation over reunion, and she suspected most men felt the same way. It was, however, impracticable for Southern men to express such opinions, and so they associated with Yankees for purely pragmatic reasons. If women were to criticize their menfolk for such actions, it would only increase their pain, and so their duty was to, quote, keep pure the fire of patriotism on behalf of a conquered people. So let me give you my interpretation of what I've chosen to call the cultural politics of memory. Scholars have long noted that war simultaneously reinforces and disrupts women's roles. On the one hand, offering men the opportunity to prove their manhood, the female population is seen as waiting passively on the home front. On the other, it immediately presents women with challenges of new roles and responsibilities in the absence of their men. If we extend this argument to examination of men's roles, we find similar contradictions. At its inception, the Civil War offered an opportunity for all white men to display their heroism and prove their manhood. For Southern men raised in an honor-bound society that required outside recognition, the war provided an ideal arena in which to prove themselves. War held a similar appeal for Northern men, especially those who found their path to independence increasingly obstructed by a burgeoning commercial capitalism. But the reality of war did not always live up to its promise, as regimentation, drill, and subordination often overshadowed displays of heroism. Paradoxically, as the currents of war led women, especially those who endured an invasion of the home front, into an increasingly political role that required demonstrations of courage and honor, the soldiers' daily regimen consisted largely of drills, marching, and fighting, all of which focused on the male body. The most extreme case, of course, was the practice of paying for a substitute to fight in one's place, a system that historian Reed Mitchell describes as a sort of gross speculation on the part of poor men. If they had nothing else to trade in, they had their own bodies. And just as horrific, it was the body parts of injured soldiers, amputated arms and legs, bandaged heads and injured knees, frostbitten fingers and toes that increasingly represented the cost of war. But in the post-war years, this objectification of men's bodies was reinterpreted as a celebration of masculine valor. Scholars of masculinity have argued that as the horrendous memories of mangled bodies faded, war was increasingly viewed as a vital component in shaping men's characters. By the 1880s and 90s, this new ideal aided the reunion process as Northern and Southern white men mutually embraced those warlike qualities. These same decades, the 80s and 90s, saw an outpouring of acclaim for Southern womanhood. However, these virulent women who had confronted the enemy with sharp words and vehemence had now become a classless category. In the words of Confederate General Wade Hampton, they deserved one virtuous name. Husbands and sons who once urged their wives and mothers to meet the Yankee invaders with defiance and even with firearms now exhorted them to, quote, honor the brave dead and strew flowers on their graves. White women's new duty was the rehabilitation of Southern men, and they were urged to reanimate their men's self-respect, confirm their men's resolve, and sustain their men's personal honor. No longer vital players in their own right, Southern women had become the appendages of heroes who had glorified themselves on the battlefield. This image of a dedicated and loyal Southern womanhood fed into a lost cause rhetoric, a rhetoric that the North would eventually come to embrace. Several scholars have now challenged this myth of Southern womanhood and applied much more nuanced analyses to Confederate women's roles in the Civil War and in the construction of historical memory. But the quest to debunk this mythical image has resulted in a counterclaim that Confederate women became increasingly disillusioned and disaffected from all things military. What I've offered here and in more detail elsewhere are some alternative interpretations. The Confederate women responded to war in diverse ways, that they had their own link to cause and comrades, and that first-hand experience in facing the enemy often reinvigorated a waning loyalty to the Confederate cause. Yet given this range of responses, the challenge still remains to explain why such an image of loyal but largely passive Southern womanhood has been accepted for so long, and how this is linked to images of Sherman and his men. As their strengths and determinations became abstractions funneled into symbolic roles of sacrifice rather than active struggle for nation, white women of the South became icons to be protected by men. This depoliticization of Confederate women's roles served multiple purposes, not least the reinvigoration of Southern manhood. Despite many examples of white Southern women's stubborn resistance and determination in the face of the enemy, in post-war rhetoric, Yankee depredations seemed even more outrageous when seen as an attack on defenseless women and children. In the quest to win a moral victory, Southerners frequently cast Yankees as responsible for the violation of manly codes by attacking the home front. And of course, William T. Sherman and his men were ideal targets for this accusation. Sherman became the personification of Yankee atrocities, and Confederate women were increasingly portrayed as these long-suffering victims. As a perfect fall to Sherman's behavior, General Robert E. Lee was honored as the epitome of Southern chivalry, a valiant and heroic leader who had surrendered only in the face of overwhelming odds. Thus, defeat on the battlefield signified Confederate valor, while subjugation of the home front merely constituted a display of Yankee moral depravity. The domestication of white women was not, however, simply about highlighting Southern men's bravery. It was also about reclaiming authority in the post-war South. White Southern men laid the blame for black men's emancipation at the feet of the North, and then used the threat of black-on-white rape as a powerful tool to control the behavior of white women and to terrorize the black population. So the memory of the Civil War glorified the role of the white soldier, occluded the roles of blacks, and rendered white Southern women victims of Northern atrocities and potential victims of black rapists. White Southern women were not, however, silent victims of these forces of racial and sexual control, but took on active and vocal roles in the creation of historical memory. Their voices took on two diametrically opposed tones. The more familiar is exemplified in a 1911 address to the first college chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Here the speaker informed the girls of Winthrop College, South Carolina, that they could conceive of no nobler and honored name than a daughter of the Confederacy. Young Southern women had a special distinction and responsibility, she said, to remind the world what their fathers had fought for and to compel for them respect and reverence for a noble cause and a worthy fight. She reminded them that in honoring our sires and their patriotism, we honor ourselves. Other Southern women, possibly those who had experienced the war more directly, were often less sentimental. By the time their memoirs were published, Southern women who had lived through the war had spent years nurturing bitter seeds of resentment. The North dominated the publication of women's wartime experiences until the early 20th century, and the first books praising Northern women's patriotism did not hesitate to compare their virtues with Southern female vices. One such volume, published in 1867, claimed that history provided few examples of more fiendish behavior than that of Confederate women. The authors hurled accusations of malevolent crimes that ranged from displays of malice and petty spite to demands for the murder of prisoners of war and trophies of Yankee skulls, scalps, and bones for ornaments. Little wonder that when Southern women had the opportunity to tell their stories, their voices often expressed more rancor and frustration than respect and reverence. And Sherman was fated to live in infamy as the scourge of the Confederacy. No one encapsulates that outlook more accurately than Elizabeth Merriweather, who observed that in those dark days just after the close of the war, hate was a feeling that came into many a Southern woman's breast. The Southern men were too busy trying to retrieve their fallen fortunes, but the women, they had more time to brood over the wrongs that had been done them. To this day, I cannot truthfully say I love Yankees, but my dear husband, who fought 4 years in the Confederate Army, seemed to feel no bitterness in his heart. not even in the years following Lee's surrender. Were he living now, more than 50 years after Appomattox, he would probably be as kindly and as just in his estimate of a Northern as of a Southern soldier. I cannot feel that way. At any rate, I cannot feel kindly towards General Sherman. He was a monster, and I want the whole world to know it. The cultural politics of war and memory reflected the interrelationship of race, sex, and the military, and together linked Sherman and the white women of the South in an eternal war. A little different from images of Lincoln, right? Never even mentioned Lincoln. Yes. Questions? Yes.
Yes, some accounts of Sherman's army through Georgia list about a half-dozen rapes. How about in your research in the Carolinas? Do you have numbers, and were there two different categories for black women and white women that may have been raped by Sherman's soldiers?
Well, most scholars agree that as far as elite white women, privileged white women, that the number of rapes was extremely low. It wasn't a common occurrence, and when it was discovered, it was severely punished. Black women were raped indiscriminately, and I suspect that poor white women probably were too, but we have absolutely no sources for poor white women. But certainly for privileged white women, there was that boundary, and they weren't commonly raped. A lot of that kind of idea of, rape and pillage through the South is a construction of a historical memory. I mean, I think it's clear the fact that, Southern men would leave women at home alone to face the enemy. And the fact that women were so defiant is that they understood that there was this boundary, that they wouldn't be physically hurt. So, I'm not... Yes.
Two things. I've seen it mentioned that the raping of black women was kind of a symbolic form of taking the Southern whites' property away from them. You come across that at all?
Yeah, and well, I think that there's two or three different versions that I've seen. One is that yes, they were property, and certainly that's one of the views. And the other symbolic view I've seen is that sometimes black women were raped in front of white women. Oh, yeah. And that, spoke volumes.
Yeah. But now also, in some recent reading I was doing, there was a suggestion that quite a few romances blossomed between these northern troops and southern women.
Yes, they did.
And they did.
And some of them are more notorious than others. I know the daughter of the president of UNC Chapel Hill married a Northerner, and it was a major scandal, and they didn't speak to her for a long time. But quite often, Northern soldiers went back and married them, so, yeah. Yes?
How important was it that, as I read Mary Chestnut's book, I got the sense that she was just as angry all along at the men of the South for having their indulgences with the slaves, and for bringing on the war, and perhaps after the war, not express the anger that they felt in the direction of their own men. How does that figure into how they...
Well, I think Mary Chestnut complains a lot about the problems of having slaves and the problems men molesting slaves and producing mulatto children. And she does make a lot of mention that this is a really severe problem. On the other hand, she never ever really envisages her world without slavery. I mean, I know I've seen some people argue that she was like this closet abolitionist, which I don't buy.
It was. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying she may have been personally angry at the infidelities of her husband and the disaster that the bringing of the war brought. She certainly wasn't anti-slavery. But what I mean to say is the personal angers that she felt maybe all along in resentments towards the men of the South and her own husband and his infidelities and so on. She couldn't express that when her husband came home. How much of that figured into expressing her anger in another way towards Sherman's?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but I think ultimately, and we can't really know what inner resentment she was feeling, but ultimately, she supported the Confederacy, and if it came to a choice of whether to be unpatriotic or complain about her husband, she would have always come for the Confederacy. That's my opinion, certainly. Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's not true.
No, I think you raise an interesting point, and it's interesting to think about.
Probably never entered into her head to express her anger or
Yeah.
personal anger in every other way.
Well, I mean, that's just one of the intriguing things that we'll never really know. But, I think probably, yeah, as a woman, there probably were times where maybe she did feel that way, but can't prove it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Mary Chesnut never, she never suspected him of having relationships. It was her father-in-law.
Oh, she hated her father-in-law.
He was the one. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
The question I have for you is, in those accounts, whether they're with white women in the Carolinas or with the slave women, what kind of context do you find these attacks taking place? Are they simply soldiers running amok on their own? Are they still under the command of officers on the spot? Are the officers giving them license to do this?
Well, in theory, there are strict rules for foraging practices.
Yeah, that is practice.
The common understanding is that Sherman, that first of all, it wasn't even reasonable to imagine that you could control men in these situations, and also that there was a blind eye turned to a lot of what these men were doing. But for instance, one of the reasons that I concentrate on Carolinas is that in Georgia, they really did very, very minimal damage. It was much more of a psychic shock for Georgians. They were just like horrified, and they were extremely humiliated that Sherman had just, marched right through their state. But the actual physical damage was very little. The physical damage in South Carolina was much, much worse. And they burnt far more homes. But the looting and plundering and taking, the thing that women talk about so much, that upsets them so much, is when they destroy things, like malicious damage, like especially cherished possessions, that they rip up portraits and they stamp on family Bibles, and what food they can't take away, they spoil. And that really, I found, built up resentments far more than any of the other things that they do. So it's malicious kind of pettiness. And did that answer your question?
I'm trying to get a sense of not just the command structure, because I understand that part, but what actually happens on the premises.
Mm-hmm.
They arrive at a plantation.
Right.
They're in the command of, depending on who they are, what size unit, they're under the command of a captain, a colonel.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're usually the foragers that come to be known as Sherman's bummers are ahead of the rest of the squad, so they pretty much can do what they want. And it's the same in any group. Some will be much worse behaved. Some of them were shocked what others were doing, but they do get carried away.
This is primarily the foragers who are doing this?
Yes. Well, they're under orders to go out and they're meant to bring food and destroy anything that could be used as war material. So, in theory, that's all they're supposed to do. But of course, they do a lot more than that. And there's a lot of them. And often families have several groups coming one after the other, which is really devastating. So you certainly know they've been. Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that one of the two crimes that Lincoln never forgave was the crime of rape.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly in no way was it ever encouraged. It's just the human nature of war that you can find in every war.
Well, I think it's a human nature in later wars and in wars against people of a different race. I think there are two things going on here. And one is, I can't, stress too strongly how much this is to do with race and class. But there's also, this is a civil war, and these are white women who are like the soldiers. In later war, war against Native American women were often raped and mutilated. But that's a different race. It's easier to kind of differentiate. And I think that, using women as a political tool of war, using rape as a political tool of war, is not something that's going on in this war. That's certainly my interpretation. This is a 19th century war. This is not a modern war. It's 19th century values. Not everybody agrees with that, but that's how I see it.
In your research of the topic, did you find that the early war incident, of staining Southern woman honor with local bad boy Benjamin Butler, that's what most people, I think, perceived, this poor comment about the women of New Orleans and the chamber plots they made later.
I mean, I think...
That thing seems to pervade everyone's thinking of what it was like.
Yeah, and I actually think that's really interesting. I don't know if all of you are familiar with Benjamin Butler was the commander in New Orleans, and they...
From Lowell, Massachusetts.
Yes. Actually, Benjamin Butler, I think, would be is the next person that intrigues me after Sherman. I'm really interested why he's not remembered as much as Sherman is lately, because when he did that, when he passed this order to say that women, Confederate women who did not treat Union soldiers with respect would be treated as if they were prostitutes. And there was this huge outcry. I think it's really interesting. And for one thing, I think that Butler actually treated these women with a lot of respect, because what he was saying to them is, you are political actors, and if you want to be political actors, then you have to face the consequences of your actions. So in that respect, you could say that he was granting them political power. On the other hand, I think it also feeds into my reading of these different ideas of what is womanly behavior, because it seems to me that for Southern men, they're saying, well, it's perfectly all right for these women to behave like that in these circumstances, and of course they're still ladies. So there's this flexibility about what a Southern lady can and cannot do. But it's a great story, and I think that it really deserves to be kind of taken apart and really looked at, because I see it, anecdotally, always just the stories told, but I think there's a lot more kind of going on there. Yeah.
A few years ago, I read quite extensively some Southern women's diaries, and one comical aspect, one woman said the ugliest thing that ever went in a night chamber pot was the picture of Benjamin Butler.
Yes.
I got a kick out of that.
Top seller, yeah, when they manufactured chamber pots with Benjamin Butler's picture in the bottom.
Oh, they still
Oh, they still do it?
I can tell you where I learned.
Didn't they, I think they were originally manufactured in South Carolina, weren't they, in Charleston? That's what I heard.
Maybe some of them. They're very readily available in New Orleans.
Oh, they are in New Orleans? I have to go get one. Put it up my wall in my office, yeah. But they never made one with Sherman, and they should have.
It's true.
That puzzles me.
Well, you see, the connection is they were throwing the contents of chamber pots
Right.
out of windows on passing by. And that's the connection.
Right.
It's a symbol of bravery for the women almost, versus I don't think there was a symbol for the women of North Carolina.
Well, the other thing that I find that I think is really very interesting is several women, especially one particularly prominent North Carolina woman, who writes just at the very end of the war that Sherman was actually pretty fair and just, and she understood what he was doing. And at the time, he wasn't the demon that he came to be. It's really kind of interesting, because he was willing to offer a very lenient peace treaty to the South, and I mean I think that's one of the major differences between Benjamin Butler and Sherman, is that Sherman, in my reading of him, wanted to be known as a bringer of harsh war but of generous peace, and he really wanted to be a peacemaker.
But let me tell you this, Sherman was the first president of what is now Louisiana State University.
Right.
And they have a magnificent oil portrait of Sherman, and it wasn't until after my time there in the 1960s that they had that thing back on display.
Really? Uh-huh. It'll take a long time, yeah. But he's an interesting man. Of course, he wasn't interested in politics, and that's the other big difference between him and Butler. And Butler wanted a political career. Sherman was not interested in politics. I mean, he hated politicians, and he hated the press more than anything, yeah.
You talked a little bit at the beginning about the sort of formation of gender roles at the beginning of the war. One of the things that I'm kind of curious about is the effect of popular literature. For example, everybody knows about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom Cabin. She never actually seen slavery in practice, but she was still able to inflame people with this book. And I had read a long time ago, and I can't remember where I read it, that somebody who said that Sir Walter Scott was probably more responsible for the Civil War than Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I was wondering about if you've run across indications of the effect of things like all the Dumas stories, all the Alexander Dumas stories, all the Three Musketeers stuff is being translated into English just before the Civil War, all the Walter Scott romances and things. And they have very interesting women's roles in them. You can see the men picking up the chivalry. I mean, you know,
Right.
Jeb Stuart is right out of a Dumas novel.
Yeah.
And do you see any effects of that kind of popular literature in definition of women's roles? You know, Ivanhoe. You know, you've got the downtrodden Saxons under the heel of the Norman aggressor. You know, do you see any, you know, downtrodden Southerners under the heel of the, you know,
I think,
analogies and things?
well, certainly, I mean, Walter Scott is incredibly popular, the most popular author, and those stories are, you're right, it's just, you know, chivalry and the lady and the knight and that kind of thing. But it's very difficult to tell how much these kind of idealized romantic roles influence actual people's lives. You know, I mean, lots of women read, you know, these romantic novels, you know, the guy with the long hair, you know, what's his name? Fabio or something. But their lives are nothing, and they maybe dream about it, but their lives, real lives, are nothing like that. So, I mean, I know it's a ridiculous example, but it's very hard to tell. I mean, I think that in any society, that these idealized roles of what men and women are supposed to do and strive for. And in reality, very few people's lives ever really match those kind of idealized roles. But the most important thing I was trying to do when we're talking about gender is to talk about your masculinity too, and roles of what men are supposed to do, because that's a part of gender too, and that's kind of one of my battles is, you know, that gender is men and women.
You had quoted the woman who said that the men should fall on their swords.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, you know,
Right.
men in the Civil War didn't fall on their swords.
No,
anyway.
they didn't.
They shot
No, they
themselves. They wanted to.
No, but certainly...
But it's an image
yes.
that comes right out of this pop.
Yes, and this group of elite women are very well read in the classics. I mean, even, you know, during the war, when they're complaining about this and that, they're still taking their afternoons and they're playing the piano while they're reading a classical novel or something. So they are very influenced, and they're pretty highly educated in that particular genre. So you're right. I imagine, like, you know, when it comes to symbolism, that those would be the images that would spring to mind. Yeah.
I'm curious, the character of Scarlett O'Hara, what impact do you think she had on America's the general population's concept of Southern women? Because I find her a fascinating character.
Huge. The honest truth is, the way I got interested in Southern history was, and I'm from Scotland, and I read Gone with the Wind when I was 15, and I thought, whoa, this is so cool. And I was just fascinated. And then when I actually started to study Southern history, I found it even more fascinating because it's so mythologized, and you just kind of, it's like an onion, you know, you just keep peeling it back.
What's fascinating about Scarlett is, as you were giving your lecture,
Yes.
Scarlett reflects all the pieces of your lecture.
Yes, she does.
And I'm thinking of all the segments in the story.
Yes.
And I'm going, oh, Scarlett did that. Oh, yeah, Scarlett did that.
Yeah,
She did that too.
Yeah, I think when you actually look at
Which is why I decided I should.
but the very interesting thing about Scarlett O'Hara is she actually does display that kind of tough,
Yes.
defiant, steely woman, but at the same time, she struggles with this image of what she wants to be. She wants to be like her mother, but she doesn't really want to be like her mother. So, I mean, I think that goes to exactly what you're saying. There's this image of what ladies should be, but to her, it's far too much trouble, and it's not nearly as lucrative. But she has this inner struggle. But the interesting thing is, and even that was written in the 1930s, that, and I've seen, you know, this discussed by scholars of literature, is that Margaret Mitchell does not allow her to win out in the end. She loses in the end. So it's kind of, you can't beat the system.
But then in that god-awful sequel that the family
Oh.
authorized.
Oh, was that painful or what? And I had forced myself to read it. I felt I have to read it to the end.
I think it's a general consensus among historians that Margaret Mitchell and Douglas Southall Freeman more or less co-equally dominate the image from the 30s through the 50s.
Oh, I think so. And when I teach my Civil War class, I always show them the excerpt from Gone with the Wind of Sherman. Because you've got, Sherman written right across the skin, and flames and fire, and I mean, it's really, really scary. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Also,
Oh, sorry.
Last comment.
okay, Margaret Mitchell, she also, in the interview, was asked, who did you model your character, Red Butler, after? And her answer was Barnwell Wreck.
But it was a lie. It was her first husband.
Even better, so.
Okay, well, I'll let you two argue that one out. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackie.